next speaker is James Robertson. He's going to speak on the Ukraine and the return of the national question. He's a socialist, originally from Australia, a member of the ISO, and is currently completing his PhD in European history at NYU. And he's also on the editorial board of Left East, a fabulous website. Yeah, I read that often. And has participated in social movements in Australia, the US, Serbia, and Russia.
Thanks. First of all, thanks to the comrades that organised this, and I don't know anyone else that was involved, but I think this is a really useful initiative to sit down and speak about what appears to be a rise of fascism in different types. I also want to begin with a disclaimer that I study Eastern European history, but I do not study Ukraine. I've never been to Ukraine. I do not speak Ukrainian, and so I need to put that out there to be clear. But my position in Left East, we've obviously been following events really carefully in what's been happening in Ukraine with the Maidan protests and trying to get a grip on the kind of debates that are happening that are emerging both from the left inside Ukraine and regionally in Europe and also globally, I think. So I think that's what I'm going to try to speak about today. I want to sort of keep going back to this quote. The comrades here stole my thunder in some extent. I was going to open with the quote from Horkheimer that they have kindly stuck at the bottom of the sheet that you all got, and I thought would be a clever little way. But I wanted to fix this quote somewhat, the quote from Horkheimer that says, "Whoever does not speak of capitalism should be equally silent of fascism." I actually want to change that to somewhat provocatively, but I want to insist that perhaps this provokes good discussion at the end. Whoever does not speak of Russian imperialism should also remain silent on Ukrainian fascism. And I'm going to come back to that point, but it is going to shape how I'm trying to respond to the situation in Ukraine at the moment. I'm going to have to really make this schematic, but I'm going to assume that everyone is up to date, at least that there was a massive political upheaval in Ukraine over the past few months, that President Yanukovych has been overthrown, and I want to sort of go from there because we just don't have time to sort of go into this more specifically. Of course, far-right groups were involved in the Maidan protests, but I think it would also be quite reductive to sort of say that this was a fascist movement, and some people on the left, by disturbingly, have continued to sort of play the card that this was a neo-fascist coup backed by the West.
Just a little bit, okay.
Sorry. They cut corners by speaking quickly. I'm also quite sick, so if I start coughing and spluttering, I apologise. So what I want to insist on here is that I want to start, first of all, by putting this dichotomy that I think the left and the commentators on Ukraine have presented. On the one hand, this is a spontaneous uprising, revolutionary uprising of the Ukrainian people to peace and democracy. On the other hand, this is a neo-Nazi coup that was established in Washington and then strategized in Brussels / Frankfurt / wherever you think the European Union is viciously intervening in Ukraine. And I think obviously both of these positions are wrong. I think they're both oversimplifications, and they completely erase the fact that for 3 months in sub-zero temperatures against quite violent police brutality, tens of thousands of ordinary people actually came out into the streets to force the government, put consistent pressure on Viktor Yanukovych for a variety of different causes. And I think this is a particularly inchoate and contradictory movement that the far right played a key role, particularly on the ground, in leading it all over. Now, I think it would also be reductive to say that de facto it is a fascist movement just by the fact that the far right participated and were actually able to pull a lot of political capital out of this movement. So there are a couple of things I want to look at from here, again, moving quite schematically. Who are the far right in the movement at the moment? Why do I think that we can't speak about Ukrainian fascism unless we also speak and recognize the fact of Russian imperialism? And then, finally, what are the sort of challenges and prospects for the Ukrainian left? And I think there are lessons here that we can extract for the left, particularly in Eastern Europe. And this is the sort of broad takeaway I want to argue here, that fascism, as it's manifesting itself in Eastern Europe particularly, is manifesting itself in a different climate than in Western Europe and Central Europe. Partly because the political context in Eastern Europe is one that is intimately shaped by imperialist competition, makes the discourse of nationalism and the fact that you have a long history of mass nationalist movements actually organising popular classes in resistance to imperialism. Now, I recognise that that's quite a provocative statement, and I think hopefully we can come back to that discussion and throw that around. But I think it is worthwhile thinking about some of these manifestations, particularly in the post-Soviet context, but also in Greece to some extent, as distinct forms of fascism and operating in quite qualitatively different political environments than, say, France, Netherlands, or the UK to some extent as well. So who are the fascists that were involved in Maidan? I want to talk mainly about two particular organizations. One is Svoboda, freedom, which Janis mentioned, and the other is Right Sector. And we've probably heard these terms being bandied about, and obviously there are more right-wing groups in Ukraine, but these are the sort of two, I think, important groups that we need to take into consideration. So first, Svoboda. Svoboda was an organization formed in the 1990s. It naturally began as an organization that always looked towards elections, but also focused quite carefully on the street movements. They were initially called the Social National Party of Ukraine, and a lot of their early symbols were, if not outright, fascist, but sort of less, they wouldn't use a swastika, but you use the wolf symbol, you don't use, etc., etc., right? So sort of less better known fascist insignia, or very closely modeled on fascist insignia, neo-Nazi insignia particularly. They had a militia, and a lot of these groups formed militias in 1991 following the coup in Moscow. There was a fear on of groups in Ukraine that new Ukrainian independence would be threatened in some way by the reassertion of communist power in Moscow, by Soviet power in Moscow, and so a lot of groups actually formed militias and were ready to defend Ukraine should the Soviet army come back across and try to reimpose Soviet authority inside Ukraine. So Svoboda began with this kind of very looking to the streets kind of movement, and then by 2010 actually broke out of that and became an electoral force. The 2009-2010 elections, as we see here, they gained something like 10% of the vote, and a lot of that was concentrated in the west, around Lvov and around sort of eastern Galicia, these sort of areas in the west. Partly they've been able to do this by modelling themselves on the BNP. We've seen a similar shift away from the kind of street politics of young skinheads going out and beating foreigners or beating up Russians or Jews to a kind of, we just want to talk about immigration, we think this is a problem, we want to talk about homosexual marriage, we think this is also a problem, and much more sort of cleaning themselves up to look like respectable parliamentary parties. And this is in part how they've been able to do this. The other way is for them to capitalise on anti-political sentiment that is rife in Ukraine, right? Absolute discontent with the political class of both sides, whether they look to Russia, whether they look to the EU. People are fed up with corruption and they're fed up with authoritarianism. And to a large extent, Svoboda have been able to capitalise on that and direct that into a very sort of populist, very right-wing and very dangerous political movement. As Janis said, they also play a key role in the new government. I think it's going to be really important for thinking about the prospects for the left. Right Sector were a group that I'm 99% sure formed during Maidan. I actually meant to check that before I came here. The last thing I did before I left the house was don't forget to, so of course the last thing I did. So Right Sector were an organisation that was really a composite, an amalgamation of different sort of street gangs, not street gangs, grassroots far-right movements, including a real sort of melange of white supremacists, Slavic mystics, all sorts of bizarre sort of conglomerations. But they were able to, in a way that the left in Ukraine was not, they were able to come together into an organised faction and intervene collectively into Maidan and really assert their politics and really build around them a periphery of people, largely through street battles with the police. I'm going to have to move on. So the question is, how did they get a hearing? And I think partly that we can't... part of the problem for, I think, a lot of the West assessing this is that we have assumed so easily that any language of anti-fascism necessarily speaks for kind of universalism or a kind of value for all human rights and everyone being treated equally, whereas in Ukraine that actually is quite clearly associated with a history of the Soviet Union in a way that makes it very murky to say very clearly whether someone's anti-fascist or whether they're pro-Russian. It makes it very difficult for people to sort of make that kind of claim. It makes it very easy for the far right to say these people are pro-Russian, these people are leftists, they're pro-Russian. And so in some ways we need to understand the sort of fear of Russian imperialism is something that really does shape, as a real political force in the past 50, 60 years, if not longer, that does continue to shape the political culture inside Ukraine today. And so I would say very schematically, this is how the far right have been able to get such a mass hearing amongst people that ostensibly wanted a less authoritarian state, a more democratic and a more accountable state, and yet a lot of these people, a sizable chunk of these people, were looking to leadership for people whose vision of a future political regime would make Viktor Yanukovych look like a soft liberal, right? And so that I think is how we try to explain this contradiction. So, in other words, we can't understand how the far right have managed to get such an audience unless we recognize the very real threat of Russian imperialism, which has of course been realized by Russian moving troops into Crimea. which is of course the best thing, exactly what the current government hoped for, because the current government are about to introduce a series of heinous IMF reforms, to the extent that the current Prime Minister said anyone that joins this government is committing political suicide. I mean, who says that, right? But the logic is preparing the ground for a series of IMF reforms that are going to be incredibly unpopular, and I guarantee you within 3 months' time we're going to see a massive political crisis in this current government. Now, what does that mean? I think there are 3 things we need to think about, and that the left needs to think about without us prescribing anything, of course, to the comrades in Ukraine, but I think there are important things that we can pull out, specifically for thinking about Eastern Europe more broadly. The political crisis that is just around the corner for the current government is going to do 2 things. On the one hand, it's going to create all sorts of prospects for the left. If they get their act together and are able to intervene collectively and really start to push back against austerity in a way that would unite people across both parts of Ukraine, East and West, Russian and Ukrainian speakers, against austerity. The danger, of course, is that the more this government goes into political crisis, the more they're going to ratchet up the rhetoric of nationalism and try to shift people's aggression into a culture war with Russian speakers, with Jews, with Romanians, with any other ethnic minority they have a problem with. So that's going to necessarily mean that any kind of anti-fascist force is going to, any kind of anti-austerity force is going to also have to be an anti-fascist force. Now, of course, the problem is that fascism gets a hearing precisely because you have a huge empire on your border that is looking to reassert its imperial authority. And so any kind of movement that wants to challenge fascism is also going to have to take up the issue of imperialism. Therefore, we have 3 issues that I think are salient, not just for the left in Ukraine, but are actually much broader for Eastern Europe as a whole. Anywhere where we are seeing contested imperialisms being a campaign against austerity and a rising fascism, I think we need to, any kind of struggle against fascism is also going to have to take into consideration the question of austerity and the question of imperialism. And I'll end it there.